June 11th, 1944. The vast, sprawling naval anchorage at Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Under the searing tropical sun, the turquoise lagoon shimmered, its placid surface reflecting the steel-gray hulls of the most powerful naval armada ever assembled in the history of human conflict. Aboard the flagship of this immense force, the fleet carrier USS Lexington, CV-16, the signal bridge was a hive of quiet, professional activity. The air was thick with the crackle of radio static as the carrier wave frequencies, alive with encrypted operational orders from Pearl Harbor, were meticulously transcribed and decoded. These streams of coded signals, once abstract groups of letters and numbers, were being transformed into the concrete, world-altering tactical directives that would set in motion the next great offensive of the Pacific War. The message was clear and unambiguous. Operation Forger was to commence. The fleet was to proceed with all due haste to the Mariana Islands, a strategic archipelago whose capture was deemed essential for the final phase of the war against Japan. The primary objectives were to execute comprehensive air superiority operations against all Japanese positions on the key islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and, crucially, to maintain fleet readiness for a decisive and widely anticipated response from the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier fleet. On the flag bridge, high above the bustling flight deck, Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Pete Mitcher, the lean, taciturn, and universally respected commander of Task Force 58, lowered his powerful binoculars and turned to his operations officer. The fleet, spread out before him as far as the eye could see, was a breathtaking spectacle of industrial might. 15 fleet and light fleet carriers, 7 modern, fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and a protective screen of 69 destroyers. This assembled task force represented the largest and most potent concentration of naval aviation power ever gathered in one place. What none of the men on that bridge, from the admiral down to the youngest signalman, could fully anticipate was the sheer scale and ferocity of the battle that was to come. They were sailing toward a confrontation that would not only decide the fate of the Marianas, but would also trigger the most devastating and one-sided carrier battle in naval history. A battle that would, in the span of 2 brutal days, effectively and irrevocably destroy Japanese naval aviation as a credible fighting force forever. The Pacific War, a vast and unforgiving theater of operations defined by immense oceanic distances, had taught American strategic planners a fundamental and decisive lesson. Aircraft carriers were not just mobile airfields. They were the absolute, undisputed capital ships, the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. The side that could control the skies above the fleet would inevitably control the seas beneath. And the side that controlled the seas could project its military power across the vast Pacific distances that had once served as Japan's greatest strategic protection. The Essex-Class aircraft carrier was the physical embodiment of America's industrial answer to this complex strategic equation of the Pacific War. As Task Force 58 finally sortied from Majuro, its immense formations cutting through the long Pacific swells at a steady 25 knots, the sheer scale of the enterprise was awe-inspiring. The massive Essex-Class carriers, the heart and soul of the fleet, each displaced a colossal 27,100 tons of seawater at their standard load. Each of these magnificent ships stretched for 872 feet in length, with a beam of 93 feet at the waterline. Vice Admiral Mitcher, standing on the exposed flag bridge of his flagship, the USS Lexington, watched with a quiet pride as the formation spread out across more than 40 miles of ocean, a perfectly orchestrated ballet of naval power. His command included a corps of 7 of the new, state-of-the-art Essex-Class carriers, the USS Essex herself, the USS Yorktown, the USS Hornet, both named for carriers lost earlier in the war, the USS Bunker Hill, the USS Wasp, the USS Lexington, and the legendary USS Enterprise, the Yorktown-class carrier. She was a full-fledged fleet carrier operating alongside the newer ships. This powerful corps was supplemented by a force of 8 Independence-class light carriers, including the USS Below Wood, USS Bataan, USS Monterey, USS Cabot, USS San Jacinto, USS Princeton, USS Langley, and USS Cowpens. Each of the massive Essex-class carriers was a self-contained floating city of war, housing a crew of 3,448 men and a powerful air group of approximately 90 aircraft. These air groups were meticulously organized into four distinct squadrons: a fighter squadron of 36 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, a dive bomber squadron of 36 Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and a torpedo bomber squadron of 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The raw mathematics of this new form of carrier warfare were elegant in their brutal simplicity. Task Force 58, at the outset of the operation, deployed nearly 900 aircraft, all operating from mobile platforms that could position themselves anywhere across the vast, trackless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The design of the Essex-class carriers was a masterclass in efficiency and operational tempo. Each carrier possessed 4 high-speed elevators, 3 on the flight deck and 1 on the side of the hull, capable of cycling aircraft between the cavernous hangar deck and the bustling flight deck in a mere 45 seconds. The powerful hydraulic flight deck catapults could launch a fully loaded 12,000-pound fighter every 30 seconds during surge operations, allowing the carrier to get a full strike package into the air with astonishing speed. Captain Arleigh Burke, Mitcher's brilliant and famously aggressive chief of staff, had calculated the tactical implications of this industrial-scale capability with his characteristic precision. Burke, a Naval Academy graduate who had also attended Harvard Law School, was a new breed of naval strategist, one who understood that modern carrier warfare was ultimately about cold, hard, time and space equations. It was a game of launch cycles, recovery windows, fuel consumption rates, and ammunition expenditure. The razor-thin difference between a glorious victory and a catastrophic defeat often came down to mere minutes in the timing of a launch or a few nautical miles in the positioning of the fleet. Aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, steaming from its anchorage at Taitai in the Philippines, Vice Admiral Jisuburo Ozawa reviewed his own operational orders for the impending decisive battle, Operation Ego. His flagship, the Taiho, was the newest and largest aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a magnificent ship that displaced 29,300 tons and carried an air group of 75 aircraft. Her most significant feature, unique among all Japanese carriers, was her heavily armored flight deck, a design innovation specifically intended to allow her to withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs and continue flight operations. Ozawa's first mobile fleet comprised 9 carriers in total, deploying a force of 430 aircraft, the last concentrated carrier striking force that Japan could hope to muster. The fleet included the veteran carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, hardened survivors of Pearl Harbor and nearly every major carrier battle of the war, along with the fleet carriers Junyo and Hayo, and the light carriers Ryoho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zoho. But the raw numbers, while impressive on paper, concealed a deep, systemic, and ultimately fatal weakness that plagued all Japanese carrier operations by the middle of 1944. The quality of their pilots had deteriorated catastrophically. Where the elite, almost legendary veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike had averaged over 700 hours of intensive flight time before entering combat, the young, hastily trained pilots aboard Ozawa's carriers in June 1944 averaged fewer than 275 hours. Some, tragically, had as little as 100 hours of total flight time. The cold, brutal mathematics of attrition had systematically destroyed the once invincible Japanese naval aviation as surely and as thoroughly as any weapon. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 400 of its most experienced and irreplaceable pilots in the disastrous Battle of Midway. Another 250 had been lost in the brutal, back-and-forth carrier battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. And hundreds more had been ground down and killed during the grueling, 6-month-long Solomon Islands campaign, a war of attrition that Japan simply could not win. As the massive American fleet approached the Mariana Islands on June 11th, it organized itself into its 4 primary tactical formations. Task Group 58.1, under the command of Rear Admiral Joseph Jocko Clark, was built around the carriers Hornet, Yorktown, Belleau Wood, and Bataan. Task Group 58.2, commanded by Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery, comprised the carriers Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot. Task Group 58.3, the flagship group, was led by Rear Admiral John W. Reeves, with the legendary Enterprise, the Lexington, the San Jacinto, and the Princeton. And finally, Task Group 58.4, under the command of Rear Admiral William K. Harrell, consisted of the carriers Essex, Langley, and Cowpens. At 1300 hours on June 11th, the first of the massive Essex-Class fighter sweeps was launched against the Japanese airfields in the Marianas. Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Brewer, the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 15, VF-15, from the USS Essex, led a force of 32 Hellcats towards a Slido airfield on Saipan. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the weapon that would dominate the coming battle, represented everything the Essex-class carriers embodied. Overwhelming superiority achieved through industrial mass production. Powered by its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, the Hellcat could reach speeds of 380 miles per hour and climb to 20,000 feet in just 7 minutes, a performance that outclassed its primary adversary in almost every respect. Aboard the USS Essex, radar operator First Class James Chun tracked the progress of Brewer's fighter sweep on the flickering screen of his SK air search radar. This revolutionary system, with its large, rotating antenna, could detect aircraft formations at ranges of up to 100 miles and at altitudes of up to 30,000 feet, providing the fleet with an unprecedented level of situational awareness. He would stop the antenna's sweep every few degrees, analyze the returning electronic signal, and then calmly report the range and bearing of the friendly fighters to the fighter directors. The Japanese air defenses in the Marianas consisted of approximately 500 land-based aircraft, a formidable force on paper. However, due to a severe lack of spare parts and trained maintenance personnel, only about half of these were actually operational. At 1335, Brewer's Hellcats encountered the first of the Japanese defenders. A force of approximately 30 Mitsubishi A6M0s rose to intercept them, but the ensuing engagement was brutally and shockingly one-sided. The Zero, a revolutionary and world-beating fighter in 1940, was now, in the summer of 1944, catastrophically obsolete. Its maximum speed of 331 miles per hour was no match for the Hellcat's power. Its climb rate to 20,000 feet required a sluggish 9.5 minutes. And its complete lack of armor protection for the pilot or self-sealing fuel tanks made it tragically vulnerable to the Hellcat's 6 heavy machine guns. But most critically, the Japanese pilots flying these obsolete machines were themselves inexperienced, averaging less than 200 hours of flight time, with many having fewer than 100 hours. The results were a grim foretelling of the larger battle to come. The first day's combat over the Marianas resulted in the destruction of 147 Japanese aircraft, for the loss of only 11 American planes. Commander David McCampbell, the commanding officer of Air Group 15 from the Essex, would later describe the one-sided slaughter with a grim and now famous phrase. It was like clubbing baby seals. The Japanese pilots, he reported, flew predictable, almost textbook patterns, failed to maintain their formation integrity under pressure, and showed shockingly poor gunnery skills. Their tactical communications, monitored by American intelligence, were confused, contradictory, and often descended into panic. Japanese naval intelligence units, monitoring the high volume of American radio traffic from their listening posts at Tai, began to understand the true magnitude of the threat that was descending upon the Marianas. A flurry of emergency messages went out to Admiral Ozawa, ordering the mobile fleet to sortie immediately from its anchorage to engage the Americans in the long-awaited decisive battle. Operation Go was officially activated. The Japanese plan, as conceived, was a multi-stage affair. It called for the land-based aircraft from the Marianas to attack and damage the American carriers first, bloodying their nose and weakening their fighter defenses, which would then allow Ozawa's more experienced carrier pilots to sweep in and deliver the killing blow. On June 13th, however, American cryptanalysts of the Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific FRUPAC, in Hawaii intercepted and, in a stunning feat of intelligence work, decoded the Japanese message traffic that revealed Ozawa's precise intentions. The mobile fleet would sortie from Taita'i, refuel in the Philippine Sea, and then proceed to attack the American invasion force at Saipan. Armed with this priceless intelligence, Admiral Raymond Spruance, the overall commander of the Fifth Fleet, made the critical and, for some, controversial decision that would shape the entire battle. Instead of detaching Task Force 58 to actively pursue and engage the Japanese fleet, he ordered Mitchell to remain tied to the Saipan invasion beaches, providing air cover for the vulnerable transports and supply ships. This decision would force Ozawa to come to them, to fight at the extreme end of his aircraft's range, in an arena that Spruance and Mitchell had carefully prepared. Aboard the USS Yorktown, Executive Officer John Jimmy Williamson, a brilliant tactician and a key member of Rear Admiral Jocko Clark's staff, began to calculate the complex tactical geometry of the impending confrontation. He, like every senior officer in Task Force 58, was acutely aware of a significant and potentially decisive Japanese advantage: the superior range of their carrier aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0, through its lightweight construction and focus on endurance, could fly an astonishing 1,940 miles on its internal fuel alone. The Nakajima B-5 Ankei torpedo bomber and the Aichi D-3 Aval dive bomber, the workhorses of the Japanese carrier fleet, possessed similar long-range capabilities. In stark contrast, the American aircraft were designed with a different philosophy. The powerful but fuel-thirsty Grumman F-6F Hellcat had a realistic combat radius of only about 340 miles. The new Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber was even shorter-legged, with a radius of just 276 miles, and the Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber could reach out to about 275 miles. This glaring disparity in range meant that Admiral Ozawa could, in theory, launch his strikes from a position far beyond the striking range of the American carriers, a standoff tactic that would allow him to attack the American fleet with relative impunity, a critical and potentially battle-winning tactical advantage. But Williamson, a student of this new form of three-dimensional naval warfare, understood what the Japanese High Command had apparently forgotten since their stunning victories of 1942. Modern carrier warfare was no longer about the individual performance statistics of a single aircraft. It was about the integrated and synergistic capabilities of an entire weapon system. It was about the revolutionary advantage of radar-directed fighter control, which could see the enemy forming up hundreds of miles away. It was about the devastating lethality of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, which transformed every ship in the fleet into a deadly fortress. It was about the incredibly well-drilled and efficient damage control procedures, which could save ships that, in any other navy, would be considered lost. It was about the disciplined and secure radio communications that allowed for the seamless coordination of hundreds of aircraft and dozens of ships. The Essex-Class carriers and their supporting task groups possessed an overwhelming, almost unquantifiable advantage in every single one of these critical categories, with the sole exception of aircraft range. Williamson and his fellow strategists were betting that these systemic advantages would be more than enough to overcome the Japanese range advantage. At 21:30 on the night of June 18th, that bet began to pay off. The American submarine USS Kavala, patrolling on a picket line specifically established to detect the Japanese approach, made contact with the main body of the Japanese mobile fleet, approximately 360 miles west-southwest of Saipan. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, skillfully and tenaciously tracked the massive enemy formation for 6 long, nerve-wracking hours, transmitting a series of detailed and accurate contact reports that were relayed to Admiral Spruance by 3 o'clock on the morning of June 19th. The Japanese were approaching from the west, exactly as predicted, and, crucially, they appear to be completely unaware that their position and course were now known to the Americans. The electronic trap was about to be sprung. As dawn broke on June 19, 1944, the weather conditions over the Philippine Sea were absolutely ideal for carrier operations. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless azure, with the ceiling and visibility effectively unlimited. A moderate easterly trade wind of about 14 knots provided the perfect wind over the deck for launching and recovering aircraft, and the sea state was a gentle Sea State 3, with long, rolling Pacific swells. It was, in short, perfect flying weather for what would soon become the largest and most consequential carrier versus carrier battle in all of human history. At 7:30, the tension in the combat information centers across Task Force 58 was broken. The radar operators aboard the USS Yorktown were the first to detect the initial wave of Japanese strike aircraft, registering them as a large, cohesive group at a range of 140 miles. The contacts were approaching from the west, flying at an altitude of approximately 18,000 feet. In the CIC of the Lexington, the flagship, the fighter direction officer, Lieutenant Joseph, Jumping Joe Eggert, a master of this new and complex art, began the cool, methodical process of vectoring the fleet's Combat Air Patrol, CAP, fighters to intercept the inbound raid. A stream of calm, professional instructions crackled over the radio, directing the new Grumman F-6, F-3 Hellcats, their engines climbing to a full-throated roar towards the incoming enemy. The Hellcats, armed with their 6 devastating .50 caliber machine guns, each carrying a deep magazine of 400 rounds per gun, clawed for altitude, their primary objective to get on top of the Japanese formation before the engagement began. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu, already a seasoned combat veteran and an ace with 12 previous victories to his name, was flying from the USS Lexington and was among the first to engage the enemy. He would later describe the surreal and shocking nature of the initial interception. "I couldn't believe it," he recalled. They were flying in a perfect, rigid V formation, like it was a pre-war air show. There was no weaving for mutual defense, no high cover, just a straight and level, textbook approach. It was beautiful, but it was also suicidal. In a dizzying, whirlwind 8 minutes of combat, Vrashu single-handedly shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, becoming an ace in a day for the second time in his combat career. The Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Commander Akira Terui, flying from the carrier Taiho, was a brave and experienced pilot, but he had never before faced the terrifying efficiency of a fully integrated, radar-directed fighter interception. His own pilots, a tragic mix of a few veterans and many raw recruits, averaging only 150 hours of flight time, were completely unprepared for the coordinated, multi-axis attacks of the American Hellcats. The American fighters, executing their well-practiced boom and zoom tactics, engaged from above and behind, using their superior speed and firepower to devastating effect. Of the 69 aircraft that comprised that first Japanese wave, a staggering 42 were shot down by the Hellcats long before they could even get within sight of the American fleet. As this aerial massacre was unfolding, another silent drama was playing out beneath the waves. At 9:10, the American submarine USS Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the massive carrier Taiho from a range of 5,000 yards. One of those torpedoes struck the carrier on her starboard side, near the forward aviation gasoline tanks. The damage at first seemed manageable, but the impact had ruptured the tanks, and highly volatile gasoline vapors began to leak and spread throughout the ship's forward sections. In a fatal and tragic error of judgment, the ship's damage control officer, Commander Ataka Kobayashi, ordered the ship's powerful ventilation systems to be reversed in an attempt to clear the fumes. This action, however, had the opposite effect, inadvertently spreading the explosive aviation gasoline vapors throughout the entire ship. The second Japanese strike wave, a massive force of 128 aircraft, was detected by American radar at 10 a.m. Once again, the radar-directed Hellcats were vectored out to intercept them, this time a full 60 miles from the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Brewer, leading Fighting Squadron 15 from the Essex, described the ensuing engagement with an almost chilling sense of detachment. It was like a training exercise back in the States, he reported. They just flew straight into our guns without taking any significant evasive action. My own wingman got on the radio and asked if we were really in combat. A staggering 97 of the 128 Japanese aircraft in this second wave were destroyed. The few that managed to penetrate the fighter screen were then met by a wall of steel from the fleet's anti-aircraft guns. The American ships' fire, now directed with incredible precision by their Mark 37 gun directors with integrated radar ranging, created a seemingly impenetrable barrier of explosions around the carriers. The new proximity-fused shells, which detonated within a lethal range of any aircraft without requiring a direct hit, were particularly devastating. The Japanese pilots who survived the ordeal and managed to limp back to their carriers would report, with a sense of awe and terror, that the American ships seemed to be surrounded by an impenetrable shield of continuous explosions. At 12:20 p.m., the submarine USS Kavala delivered another devastating blow, putting 4 torpedoes into the side of the veteran carrier Shokaku. The ship's captain, Captain Hiroshi Matsubara, immediately ordered counterflooding to correct the list, but the damage was catastrophic. The Shokaku, a survivor of the Coral Sea and the Eastern Solomons, was a tough ship, but 9 long months of constant operations without a proper shipyard overhaul had weakened her damage control capabilities and strained her crew. Aviation fuel leaked from ruptured tanks and ignited, and her bomb and torpedo magazines began to detonate in a series of massive, sympathetic explosions. 3 hours later, the Shokaku, a proud veteran of the Pearl Harbor strike, sank, taking 1,263 of her men with her to a watery grave. The third Japanese wave, a much smaller force of 47 aircraft launched at 10 a.m., finally reached the vicinity of the American fleet at 1 p.m. Only 7 of those aircraft would ever return to their carriers. A fighter pilot, Ensign Keniyoshi Muto, one of the handful of survivors from this wave, would later testify to the terrifying efficiency of the American defense. The American fighters were everywhere, he said. They were above us, they were beside us, they were behind us. Their tactics were perfect. We never had a chance. Admiral Ozawa, his communications in disarray and still receiving overly optimistic and wildly inaccurate reports from the few surviving pilots, remained largely unaware of the true scale of his mounting losses. He ordered a fourth strike of 82 aircraft at 11:30 a.m. This wave, confused by poor communications and critical navigation errors, split into 2 separate groups. One group of 33 aircraft flew north and found nothing but empty ocean. The other group, 49 aircraft strong, stumbled upon Task Group 58.2. In a brief, brutal engagement lasting only 12 minutes, American Hellcats destroyed 30 of their number. At 2:52 p.m., a massive, cataclysmic explosion suddenly destroyed the carrier Taiho. The accumulated aviation fuel vapors, which had been spreading throughout the ship for hours, had finally reached a critical concentration and were likely ignited by a spark from a generator or a short circuit. The detonation was immense, breaking the massive carrier's back and sending her to the bottom with 1,650 men, including most of Admiral Ozawa's highly experienced air staff. Ozawa himself survived, having been convinced to transfer his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro just moments before the explosion. But with his flagship gone and his communications in chaos, effective command and control of the mobile fleet had all but ceased. By the time the sun began to set on the evening of June 19th, the Japanese had launched a total of 373 carrier aircraft in their 4 main strike waves. Only a battered and demoralized 130 of those aircraft had returned. American losses for the day totaled a mere 29 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, with the vast majority of the pilots being successfully rescued. The kill ratio for the day's air combat exceeded a staggering 10-1, the most lopsided air combat result of the entire war. The American pilots, averaging between 300 and 500 hours of high-quality flight time, had systematically and completely destroyed their inexperienced and outmatched opponents. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was over, but the final act of the battle was yet to come. At 1540 on the afternoon of June 20th, a full day after the devastating aerial massacre that would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a pair of sharp-eyed search aircraft from the USS Enterprise finally located the battered and retreating remnants of Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet. They were 275 miles west-northwest of Task Force 58, steaming away as fast as their damaged ships could manage. The range was extreme, well beyond the normal combat radius of the American carrier aircraft. Any strike launched at this late hour would mean that the returning pilots would have to find their carriers and land in the pitch-black darkness of a moonless night, a maneuver that carrier aviation doctrine of the time strongly discouraged as being almost suicidally dangerous. But Admiral Mark Pete Mitchell, a man known for his aggressive instincts and his deep-seated affection for his pilots, understood with a cold, hard clarity that this might be the only and final opportunity to complete the utter destruction of Japanese naval aviation. At 1621, Mitchell made his fateful and now legendary decision, issuing a simple, laconic order that would echo through naval history: launch everything you've got. In a stunning display of flight deck efficiency, a massive strike of 240 aircraft was launched in just 10 minutes from the decks of 11 carriers. The strike package consisted of 85 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 77 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 54 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The fuel calculations for this mission were critical and unforgiving. Every single pilot knew that they had been given exactly enough fuel for the outbound flight. A single pass at the target and a straight-line return with absolutely no margin for error, combat maneuvering, or delays. Lieutenant Commander James Jig Dog Ramage, a veteran pilot leading Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise, briefed his young pilots with a grim and stark honesty. "Gentlemen," he told them, "this is a one-way ticket unless you watch your fuel like a hawk. Lean mixture, optimal cruise settings, and absolutely no unnecessary maneuvering. We get one pass and one pass only at the target, then it's a straight line home." The American strike force found the Japanese fleet at sunset, a collection of dark, fleeing shapes against a blood-red horizon. In the fading, ethereal light, the carrier Hyo took multiple torpedo hits from the Avengers of the USS Bellowwood. The old carrier, a converted passenger liner, had inadequate internal subdivision and damage control capabilities. She sank in 2 hours, taking 250 of her men with her. The fleet carriers Zikaku and Chiyoda were also heavily damaged, along with the battleship Haruna. The return flight to Task Force 58 became a harrowing epic of navigation, endurance, and sheer survival. As complete darkness fell across the vast, empty ocean, aircraft began to run out of fuel. Desperate pilots, their engines sputtering and quitting, were forced to ditch their planes in the sea, hoping to be found by the fleet's destroyers. Others made it to the general vicinity of the task force, but were unable to find their specific carriers in the disorienting blackness. At 2045, with his airwaves filled with the increasingly desperate calls of lost and fuel-starved pilots, Mitchell made the most famous and courageous decision of his career. "Turn on the lights," he ordered, in an act that defied all naval doctrine and exposed his fleet to the risk of submarine attack. Every single ship in Task Force 58 was illuminated. Powerful searchlights pointed their beams vertically into the sky, creating pillars of light. Running lights blazed. Flight deck lights outlined the landing areas, and destroyers fired star shells that burst overhead, providing a momentary, ghostly illumination. For 2 chaotic and incredible hours, the fleet recovered its aircraft, with many pilots landing on any available deck, regardless of which carrier they had launched from. A total of 80 aircraft were lost in this desperate recovery effort, either to fuel exhaustion or deck crashes, but due to the lights and the heroic efforts of the rescue destroyers, most of the pilots and aircrew were saved. The mission had cost American carrier aviation dearly, but the offensive power of Japanese carrier aviation was, now and forever, completely and utterly finished. By the dawn of June 21st, The full, catastrophic scale of the Japanese disaster was becoming clear. In 2 brutal days of combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 3 of its finest fleet carriers, the Taiho, the Shokaku, and Ohio. More critically, they had lost somewhere between 476 and 600 aircraft, including the land-based planes that had been sacrificed in the Marianas, and approximately 445 of their irreplaceable carrier aircrew. The few demoralized survivors who flew back to Ozawa's remaining carriers possessed neither the skill, the experience, nor the numbers to ever again conduct effective offensive operations. American losses, while significant, totaled 123 aircraft, with 76 aircrew killed. More importantly, Task Force 58 still possessed over 750 fully operational aircraft with highly trained and now battle-hardened pilots. The brutal, inexorable industrial mathematics were clear. American training programs were now producing over 2,000 new naval aviators every single month. Each of these pilots received a minimum of 500 hours of high-quality, standardized flight training, including at least 50 hours in their assigned operational aircraft types. Their advanced training included the latest techniques in radar interception, night operations, and instrument flying. In tragic contrast, the Japanese pilot training program had almost completely collapsed, now producing pilots with only 100 to 150 hours of total flight time, with many receiving as little as 50 hours in their operational types. Crippling fuel shortages had all but eliminated advanced training flights. The most experienced instructors had been recalled to fill the depleted combat units. The accelerated programs were now producing pilots who could barely take off and land, let alone engage in complex and deadly combat maneuvering. Commander David McCampbell, who would go on to become the U.S. Navy's leading ace with a total of 34 victories, later analyzed the tactical implications with a cold, professional eye. By June of 1944, he stated, "We weren't fighting the same Japanese Navy that attacked Pearl Harbor. Those incredible pilots were all dead. We were fighting kids who could barely fly their airplanes." The Essex-Class carriers and their air groups were weapons designed for industrial warfare, and it was a war that Japan simply could not compete in. Statistical analysis of the battle revealed the devastating and almost unimaginable efficiency of American carrier operations. Each of the new Essex-Class carriers could launch a full strike of 40 aircraft in just 12 minutes. A full recovery of those aircraft required only 18 minutes, and a complete rearming and refueling cycle could be accomplished in just 45 minutes. In theory, each of the 15 carriers in Task Force 58 could generate 3 full strikes in a 4-hour period, meaning that the task force as a whole could, if necessary, put over 600 aircraft over a single target simultaneously. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had shattered Japanese naval aviation beyond any hope of recovery. Admiral Toyoda's subsequent, grim assessment was blunt and final. The first mobile fleet has been rendered ineffective as an offensive force. Our carrier pilot strength is exhausted. We must now adopt alternative tactics. Those alternative tactics would manifest 4 months later in the desperate, suicidal form of the kamikaze attacks, the final desperate resort of a navy that could no longer train conventional pilots to fight and survive. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who had been rescued from the water after the Taiho's sinking, submitted his final, heartbreaking report on June 24th. "The enemy's radar-controlled interception was perfect," he wrote. "Their pilots displayed an overwhelming superiority in every single aspect of air combat. Our attacks were defeated before they could ever reach an effective range. The mobile fleet's air groups have, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a combat force." The Essex-Class carriers had completely and utterly validated the American approach to modern naval warfare, a doctrine built on the foundation of industrial mass production. Each new ship that was launched incorporated the hard-learned lessons from previous combat. Improved ventilation systems were installed to prevent the accumulation of the explosive gasoline vapors that had doomed so many carriers, including the Taiho. Enhanced damage control training and equipment meant that even severely damaged ships, like the USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill later in the war, would survive attacks that would have certainly sunk earlier designs. The production statistics alone revealed the utter futility of the Japanese resistance. By June of 1944, American shipyards had already commissioned 7 of the new Essex-Class carriers, with a staggering 17 more already under construction. The Newport News Shipbuilding Company, a single shipyard, was launching a new, fully equipped fleet carrier every 6 months. The total construction time for these massive and complex warships had been reduced to an incredible 14 months through the use of standardized components and assembly line techniques. The technological gap was equally, and perhaps even more, decisive. American radar systems now provided reliable 100-mile detection ranges with integrated height-finding capability. The Mark 37 gun director, paired with the Mark 12 radar, could track and engage aircraft at ranges of up to 40,000 yards. The VD proximity fuses had increased the lethality of anti-aircraft fire by an estimated 300%, and the Combat Information Centers coordinated all of these defensive efforts with an unprecedented and overwhelming efficiency. In stark contrast, Japanese technology remained largely frozen at its 1941 levels. The Zero fighter, a revolutionary aircraft at the beginning of the war, had received only minor and inadequate improvements. Japanese radar systems were primitive, unreliable, and distrusted by their own operators. Their communications equipment was obsolete. And most critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity and the flexible engineering culture to rapidly incorporate combat lessons into new and improved designs. The human cost of the battle was staggering, particularly for the Japanese. Of the roughly 450 Japanese aircrew lost in the Philippine Sea, most were irreplaceable veterans with over a year of combat experience. Their loss meant that the institutional knowledge of complex carrier operations, a body of expertise that had taken years to build, effectively died with them. The few survivors lacked the experience to train the next generation of pilots or to develop effective new tactics. In contrast, American personnel policies were designed to ensure a continuity of experience. Combat tours were limited in length to preserve the lives of veteran pilots. Rotation policies meant that every squadron always contained a healthy mixture of seasoned veterans and fresh newcomers. And the most experienced pilots were regularly rotated home to serve as instructors in the training commands, ensuring that the latest tactical lessons learned in the crucible of combat were immediately incorporated into the training curriculum. This systematic and enlightened approach to human resource management proved to be just as decisive as any technological superiority. By October of 1944, when the Imperial Japanese Navy made its final desperate gambit at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the powerful carrier force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor no longer existed. 4 of the remaining Japanese carriers sailed with Admiral Ozawa as a sacrificial decoy force, carrying a paltry total of only 108 aircraft, flown by half-trained and terrified pilots. The ensuing engagement off Cape Engano was less a battle than a methodical execution. American carrier aircraft sank all 4 of the Japanese carriers while losing only 10 of their own aircraft. The Essex-Class carriers would continue to dominate operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, but their greatest and most decisive victory had already been won. In 2 short, brutal days over the Philippine Sea, they had achieved what 3 long years of grinding, bloody attrition had failed to accomplish: the complete and utter destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. Admiral Chester Nimitz's assessment of the battle was characteristically understated and precise. The Essex-Class carriers and their air groups represented American industrial democracy at war. Mass production, technological innovation, and systematic training created a weapon system that the Japanese could neither match nor counter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a tactical victory. It was a complete and total validation of the American approach to modern, industrial-scale warfare. Its legacy would extend far beyond the Second World War. A total of 24 Essex-Class carriers were ultimately completed, and they would go on to serve with distinction through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and well into the 1970s. The USS Lexington, the proud survivor of the Philippine Sea Battle, remained in commission as a training carrier until 1991, a testament to the robust and adaptable design that had revolutionized naval warfare. In the dark, silent depths of the Pacific Ocean, 3 Japanese carriers now rest on the seabed, their aircraft still in their hangars, their pilots forever at their stations. They stand as silent monuments to the last, desperate moment when individual skill and the warrior spirit might have hoped to overcome the cold, hard logic of industrial mass production. But the mathematics, as Executive Officer Williamson had so clearly understood, were inexorable. The Essex-Class carriers had not just won a battle. They had demonstrated with brutal finality that the future of naval warfare belonged to the nations that could successfully mobilize their industrial democracy, their technological innovation, and their systematic approach to training on a massive and overwhelming scale. Bullsha. https://synonym.org/si